You're not stupid. You're just afraid.
He owned half of London before he turned 18. Penthouse views, chauffeurs waiting, a surname that made grown men nervous. But he couldn't write a single paragraph that made sense. Everyone had given up, his tutors, his headmaster, even his mother, until a Pakistani cleaning woman with calloused hands and sharp eyes stopped him in an empty corridor and said 7 words that tore through him like glass. You're not stupid.
You're not stupid.
You're just afraid.
You're just afraid.
He thought she swept floors. He didn't know she was about to sweep away every lie he'd ever believed about himself. Dear family, this journey means so much to me, and I can't do it alone. I'm asking you, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Every single subscriber feels like a hand reaching back to lift me higher. Please, let your heart guide you, and help me by clicking subscribe. It would mean the world to me. I pray that may peace fill your home, joy fill your heart, and may every step you take lead you closer to your dreams. As you support this channel, may blessings return to you multiplied. Let's dive into the character. The September rain hammered against the windows of Westminster Academy like accusations. Inside, 17-year-old Julian Pemberton Cross slouched in the back row of his advanced literature class, designer headphones dangling around his neck, scrolling through his phone with the kind of boredom only the obscenely wealthy can afford. His blazer, custom-tailored, naturally, hung open. His tie was loosened to the point of mockery. Around him, 30 other students hunched over their copies of Hamlet, pens scratching, but Julian hadn't opened his book in weeks. Why would he? The leather-bound volume was pristine, purchased by his family's personal assistant and never touched. Mr. Pemberton Cross, came the clipped voice of Mrs. Ashworth, the literature teacher whose patience had worn thin months ago. Perhaps you'd care to share your thoughts on Hamlet's existential crisis? Julian looked up slowly, a practiced smirk playing at his lips. I think he should have just inherited the kingdom and moved on. All that thinking got him killed. A few nervous laughs rippled through the classroom. Mrs. Ashworth's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. What could she say? Julian's family had endowed the school's entire humanities wing. The Pemberton Cross name was etched in gold above the library entrance. The bell rang. Students filed out, whispering. Julian took his time, checking his messages. His father's driver had texted, "Car's waiting, Mr. Julian. Your mother requests you home by 4. He grabbed his bag, Italian leather, worth more than most people's monthly rent, and headed toward the exit. But something made him pause. Through the window of the adjacent classroom, he saw it, red ink bleeding across his most recent essay. Grade, 12/100. Comment, this is incomprehensible. Please see me immediately. He'd forgotten to pick it up. Now it sat on the teacher's desk like evidence of a crime he'd committed against education itself. Julian's chest tightened, not with shame, but with something worse. Confirmation. He really was as hollow as he felt. That evening, the Pemberton Cross residence in Belgravia glowed like a jewel box. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a family that looked more like a photograph than real people. Vivian Pemberton Cross, Julian's mother, sat at the head of the dining table, her posture perfect, her smile fixed. She wore pearls and disappointment in equal measure. Across from her sat Julian's father, Richard, a venture capitalist whose empire spanned 3 continents. He didn't look up from his tablet. Julian, Vivian began, her voice smooth as silk over stone, your headmaster rang today. Julian pushed risotto around his plate. Did he? He says you're failing 4 subjects. 4. She paused, letting the number settle like dust. Your coursework is, how did he put it, alarmingly incoherent. Richard finally looked up. His eyes were cold, calculating. Are you trying to embarrass this family? I'm trying to get through the term, Julian muttered. You're not trying at all, Richard said. You've had private tutors since you were 8. The finest schools money can buy. Every advantage. And yet you perform like someone with none. Julian's fork clattered against his plate. Maybe I'm just not smart. The silence that followed was suffocating. Vivian dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin. You're a Pemberton Cross. Intelligence is inherited, not optional. Then maybe the inheritance skipped me, Julian shot back. Richard stood abruptly. You have one term. What? If your grades don't improve, you're out. No trust fund. No allowances. No car. You'll learn what it means to earn something for once in your life. Julian stared at his father, searching for a crack in that granite expression. There was none. Understood? Richard pressed. Understood, Julian whispered. But he didn't understand. Not really. He didn't understand how to fix what was broken inside him, or even what that brokenness was. All he knew was that the walls of his golden cage were closing in. The next morning, Julian arrived late. The marble corridors of Westminster Academy echoed with the sounds of lockers slamming and hushed conversations. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, avoiding everything. Near the east stairwell, something caught his attention, the rhythmic swish of a mop against tile. He glanced over and saw her. She was small, perhaps in her 50s, with graying black hair pulled into a tight bun. Her uniform was faded but clean. She moved with precision, her strokes methodical, almost meditative. Her face was calm, weathered, and entirely unbothered by the chaos of teenage energy swirling around her. Julian had seen her before, of course he had. She was part of the landscape, invisible infrastructure. But today, for reasons he couldn't name, he noticed her. As he passed, she looked up. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. "Morning," she said simply, her accent lilting, Pakistani, maybe, or Indian. Julian blinked, surprised. No one spoke to him unless they wanted something. "Morning," he replied, awkward. She returned to her work without another word, humming softly under her breath. Julian stood there a moment longer than necessary, then walked away, feeling strangely seen. The week bled into a gray monotony. More failed assignments. More whispered conversations in faculty lounges. More avoidance. Julian tried, in his own half-hearted way. He hired another tutor, his fourth that year, a Cambridge graduate named Timothy who spoke in infuriatingly cheerful tones and used words like "unlock your potential." It lasted 3 sessions. "I'm sorry, Julian," Timothy said during their final meeting, packing his leather satchel. "I can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped." Julian didn't argue. What was the point? That afternoon, he skipped his last class and wandered the empty hallways. He found himself near the forgotten West Wing, a section of the school used mostly for storage and maintenance. It smelled of lemon cleaner and old books. And there she was again. The cleaning woman. She sat on a stool near a mop bucket, reading a battered paperback. The cover was worn, the title barely visible, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. Julian stopped in his tracks. She looked up, unsurprised. Lost? No. Just avoiding. Avoiding what? He shrugged. Everything, I guess. She closed her book, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You're the Pemberton Cross boy." "Julian." He corrected, though he didn't know why it mattered. "Amina," she replied. "I clean this place. And I notice things." "Like what?" "Like the fact that you walk these halls like a ghost. Like you're already gone." Her words hit him harder than any lecture ever had. He opened his mouth to deflect, to joke, but nothing came. "Why do you care?" he asked instead. Amina tilted her head. "Because I used to be a teacher. And I know what drowning looks like." Julian felt his throat tighten. "I'm not drowning." "Then why are you here, hiding in a corridor, talking to a woman with a mop?" He had no answer. Amina stood, picking up her bucket. "You're not stupid, Julian. You're just afraid." She walked past him, leaving those 7 words hanging in the air like a challenge, like a lifeline, like the first true thing anyone had said to him in years. Julian stood alone in the hallway, his chest tight, his hands shaking. For the first time in his life, he wanted to know more. Not about Shakespeare or calculus. About himself. About what it meant to be afraid. And what it might take to stop running. Julian couldn't sleep. Amina's words circled his mind like birds of prey. "You're not stupid. You're just afraid." Afraid of what? Failure? His father? The future? All of it. None of it. He didn't know. By the time dawn broke over London, Painting the Thames in shades of gray and gold, Julian had made a decision. A reckless, impulsive, desperate decision. He was going to find her. Westminster Academy opened its doors at 7:30. Julian arrived at 7, slipping through the side entrance near the maintenance rooms. The corridors were empty except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a vacuum cleaner. He found Amina in the staff room, wiping down tables, her movements efficient and unhurried. She glanced up as he entered, one eyebrow raised. "You're early." "I couldn't sleep," Julian admitted. "Guilt does that." He bristled. "I'm not." "I didn't say you should feel guilty," Amina interrupted, setting down her cloth. "I said guilt keeps people awake, whether it's earned or not." Julian exhaled, deflating. "You said I was afraid." "You are." "Of what?" Amina crossed her arms, leaning against the table. "That's not my question to answer. But if you want to figure it out, I'll help you." "Help me how?" "The way I helped students for 15 years before I ended up here," she said. "By teaching you to think." Julian felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in months. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm a teacher. It's not what I do, it's what I am. Cleaning floors doesn't change that." He nodded slowly. "What do I have to do?" Amina pulled a chair out, gesturing for him to sit. "First, tell me the truth. Why are you failing?" "I don't know." "That's a lie." "Try again." Julian clenched his fists. "Because I don't understand anything. I read the same sentence 10 times and it's still just words. I write essays and they come back covered in red ink. Everyone looks at me like I'm wasting their time. And you believe them. Shouldn't I?" Amina leaned forward. "No. Because understanding isn't about intelligence. It's about patience. About asking the right questions. About letting yourself not know something without shame." Julian's voice cracked. "But I've always not known. I've been pretending my whole life." "Then stop pretending," Amina said simply. "Start learning." And so it began. Every morning, before the school filled with noise and judgment, Julian met Amina in the West Wing. She brought books, not textbooks, but novels, essays, philosophy. Things that demanded more than memorization. "Read this," she said one morning, handing him a slim volume. "The Fire Next Time" by James Baldwin. Julian opened it cautiously. "What's it about?" "Everything. Power. Identity. Fear." She paused. "It's about what it means to be human when the world tells you you're not." He read the first page slowly, stumbling over words, rereading sentences. Amina didn't rush him. She sat nearby, working on her own reading, occasionally glancing up to check his progress. "This is hard," Julian muttered. "It should be," Amina replied. "Easy things don't change you." Over the following weeks, a rhythm emerged. Julian would read. Amina would ask questions, not about plot, but about meaning. What is Baldwin saying about anger? Why does he call it fire? What burns in you? At first, Julian's answers were shallow, defensive. But Amina never let him hide. "You're performing," she'd say. "Stop trying to sound smart and just say what you feel." "I feel lost." "Good. That's honest. Start there." Slowly, painstakingly, Julian began to write. Not essays designed to impress teachers, but reflections. Message. Amina read every word. Her feedback was surgical, sharp but never cruel. "This sentence hides." "What are you afraid to say?" Julian would rewrite. And again. "Why do you care so much?" he asked one morning, frustrated after his 5th revision. Amina looked at him steadily. "Because you remind me of my son." Julian froze. "You have a son?" "Had," she corrected quietly. "He died. 10 years ago. Cancer." The air thickened with grief. "He was brilliant," Amina continued. "Wanted to be a doctor. But he struggled in school, not because he wasn't smart, but because no one saw him. Teachers looked at his name, his skin, his accent, and decided he wasn't worth the effort." Julian's chest ached. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be better." She handed him back his draft. now covered in notes. He never got the chance to become who he was meant to be. You do. Don't waste it. Word spread slowly, inevitably. A few students noticed Julian's transformation. He started participating in class, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. His essays improved. Not perfect, but present. Alive. Some students were curious. Others suspicious. "Why are you actually trying now?" asked Dev, a classmate who'd once mocked Julian's wealth. Julian hesitated. "Someone's helping me." "Oh, another expensive tutor." "No," Julian said carefully. "Someone who cares." Dev raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. But not everyone was supportive. Oliver Grant Hughes, a senior whose family rivaled Julian's in wealth and status, cornered him one afternoon near the lockers. "Heard you've been spending time with the cleaning staff?" Oliver sneered. "What, Daddy cut off your allowance so you're networking down?" Julian's jaw tightened. "She's teaching me. She's a janitor. She's a human being," Julian shot back. "And she's done more for me than anyone in this entire school." Oliver laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Careful, Pemberton Cross. People might think you've gone soft." Julian stepped closer. "Or maybe I've just started seeing clearly." The confrontation rippled through the school. By the end of the week, whispers followed Julian everywhere. Some admiring, most confused. His parents heard about it, of course. "Is it true?" Vivian demanded over dinner. "You're associating with the cleaning woman?" "Her name is Amina," Julian said. "And yes." Richard set down his fork. "This is humiliating." "Why?" Julian challenged. "Because she's not rich? Because she's an immigrant? Because she actually gives a damn about me?" "Watch your tone," Richard warned. "Or what?" Julian's voice rose. "You'll cut me off? Go ahead. I'd rather have nothing and know who I am than have everything and feel empty." The table fell silent. Vivian's expression softened, just barely. "Julian." But Richard's face was stone. "You have until the end of term. Prove you're serious, or you're done." Julian stood, pushing his chair back. "I already am serious. You're just too blind to see it." He left the dining room, his heart pounding, his hands trembling. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. The next morning, Julian found Amina earlier than usual. She was in the library, reshelving books that students had left scattered across tables. A quiet act of care no one would ever thank her for. "My father thinks I'm wasting my time with you," Julian said, his voice echoing in the empty space. Amina continued her work. "And what do you think?" "I think he's never been right about me. Not once." She turned, regarding him with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Then why does his opinion still hurt?" Julian exhaled. "Because part of me still wants him to see me. Really see me." "He will," Amina said. "But not until you stop performing for him. Not until you become someone worth seeing, not by his standards, but by yours." She handed him a new book. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. "Read this," she instructed. "And then tell me what you're searching for." Julian took the book, feeling its weight, literal and metaphorical. "What if I don't find it?" "Then you keep searching," Amina replied. "That's what makes you human." The winter term descended on Westminster Academy with characteristic British gloom. Grey skies, early darkness, and the constant patter of rain against ancient windows. But inside Julian, something was shifting, tectonic plates of identity grinding against each other, painful and necessary. His mornings with Amina had become sacred. They met at 6:30 now, before even the earliest staff arrived, in a small office that had once been a storage room. Amina had transformed it with permission from the head of maintenance, a fellow immigrant who understood the quiet revolution happening within these walls. A single desk, 2 chairs, a kettle for tea, and books. So many books. Today, Amina began, pouring hot water over tea bags. "We're going to talk about voice." Julian wrapped his hands around the offered mug. "I thought we've been working on that." "We've been working on honesty," she corrected. "Voice is different. Voice is how your truth sounds when you stop apologizing for it." She pulled out several essays, not his, but pieces from published writers. Zadie Smith, Hanif Kureishi, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Read these aloud, Amina instructed. Tell me what you hear. Julian read slowly, stumbling at first, then finding rhythm. Each writer had a distinct cadence, a particular way of seeing the world that made their words unmistakable. They sound certain, Julian observed. Like they know exactly what they want to say. They sound like themselves, Amina corrected. Certainty is different from authenticity. You can be uncertain and still have a voice. In fact, uncertainty is often where the strongest voices are born. She handed him his latest draft, a reflection on man's search for meaning. This is good, she said, but it's still hiding. You're writing what you think I want to read. I want to know what you think. What scares you about Frankel's ideas? Julian stared at the page. That meaning isn't given. That you have to create it yourself. And I don't know if I can. Amina leaned forward. Why not? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Julian felt his throat tighten, emotions he'd kept locked away suddenly pressing against the surface. Because everything I have, everything I am, was created by someone else, he said, voice cracking. My name, my school, my future, it's all inherited. I've never built anything myself. What if I'm incapable? What if without my family's money and influence, I'm just nothing? The confession left him hollowed out, vulnerable in a way he'd never allowed himself to be. Amina's expression softened. Do you know why I left teaching? Julian shook his head. I was at a university in Lahore, she began. One of the best in Pakistan. I had tenure, respect, a career I'd spent 20 years building. Then I published a paper criticizing the administration's corruption. How they were accepting bribes for admissions, falsifying research, destroying the integrity of education. She paused, her hands steady around her tea. They offered me money to retract it. A lot of money. When I refused, they destroyed my reputation. Called me a troublemaker. A liar. Made sure no other institution would hire me. My husband had just died. My son was gone. And suddenly I had nothing. Julian listened, aching. So I came here, Amina continued, to London. Started over. The only work I could find was cleaning. And for a long time, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. She looked at him directly. But then I realized something. They could take my position, my salary, my professional identity. But they couldn't take what I knew. They couldn't take my ability to teach, to see clearly, to speak truth. That was mine. And it still is. So you didn't lose everything, Julian said quietly. No. I lost what could be taken. And I discovered what couldn't. She tapped his draft. That's what you're searching for, Julian. The part of you that exists independent of your family's name. The part that can't be inherited or bought or taken away. Your voice. Your truth. Yourself. Julian felt tears prick his eyes. He blinked them away, embarrassed. Don't, Amina said gently. Tears aren't weakness. They're honesty breaking through. He nodded, unable to speak. Now, Amina said, her tone shifting back to teacher mode, rewrite this. Not for me. Not for your professor. For the person you're becoming. Tell me what you're really afraid of. And then tell me what you're going to do about it. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. Julian's English teacher, Dr. Margaret Foster, requested a meeting. She was a woman in her 60s, sharp-eyed and skeptical, who'd been teaching at Westminster for 30 years and thought she'd seen everything. Mr. Pemberton Cross, she began, sliding his latest essay across her desk. This is different. Julian's stomach clenched. Different bad or different good? Different real, she replied. Your previous work was technically competent but emotionally vacant. This has a pulse. Thinks. Feels. It argues with itself. She paused. Who's been helping you? Julian hesitated. Does it matter? It does if this isn't your own work. It is, Julian insisted. Every word. Someone's been teaching me how to think, not what to write. There's a difference. Dr. Foster studied him. The cleaning woman. Amina Khatri. Julian's eyes widened. How did you? I've been teaching here for 3 decades. I notice everything. She leaned back in her chair. She was a professor, you know. Quite renowned. I read some of her papers when I was doing my doctorate. Brilliant mind. Then why is she cleaning? Because institutions are cowards. They punish truth-tellers and protect power. Dr. Foster's expression hardened. But that doesn't mean what she's doing with you isn't valuable. It's perhaps the most valuable education happening in this school. Julian felt a surge of gratitude mixed with anger. So why doesn't anyone help her? Why doesn't the school hire her to teach? Because systems resist change, Julian. Especially change that reminds them of their own failures. She pushed his essay back toward him. But you can help her. By becoming proof that her methods work. By succeeding so undeniably that people have to acknowledge what she's accomplished. How do I do that? By continuing exactly what you're doing, right? Grow. And when you're ready, speak so loudly they can't ignore you. That afternoon, Julian found 4 other students waiting outside the storage room turned classroom. He recognized them: May, a scholarship student from Hong Kong; Jamal, whose parents were refugees from Somalia; Priya, whose working-class accent marked her as different despite her intelligence; and Sophie, who struggled with dyslexia but had ideas that made Julian's head spin. What's going on? Julian asked. May spoke first. We heard you were getting help. Real help. We want in. Amina appeared behind them, arms crossed, amused. Seems word travels fast. Can you teach all of us? Priya asked, hopeful and hesitant. Amina looked at Julian. He understood the question in her eyes. This is your choice. Once we open this door, we can't close it again. Julian thought of Dr. Foster's words. Become proof that her methods work. Yes, he said firmly. She can. And she should. Amina smiled. A real smile, full of light. Then we'd better find more chairs. What began as individual mentorship became a collective awakening. 6 students met 3 times a week in that small room. They read voraciously Baldwin, Woolf, Orwell, Angelou, Rushdie. They wrote constantly, essays that questioned, challenged, explored. They debated fiercely but respectfully, learning that disagreement didn't mean disrespect. Amina taught them to read critically, to question assumptions, to follow arguments to their logical conclusions. She taught them that intelligence wasn't about memorizing facts but about making connections. That wisdom wasn't about having all the answers but about asking better questions. Don't tell me what the text says, she challenged. Tell me what it means, what it reveals, what it hides, why it matters. The sessions were electric. Julian watched May connect post-colonial theory to her own experience of displacement. He listened as Jamal drew parallels between refugee narratives and contemporary politics. He marveled as Sophie, who'd been told she was slow, articulated insights that left everyone speechless. And slowly, Julian found his own voice emerging. Not the performative confidence of privilege, but something quieter, deeper. The voice of someone who'd been lost and was finding his way home to himself. But growth attracts attention. And not all attention is kind. Oliver Grant Hughes had been watching. And he was furious. The confrontation came during lunch on a Wednesday in late February. Julian was sitting with his small study group, discussing their latest reading, when Oliver approached with 3 of his friends, all children of wealth, all threatened by what Julian represented. So this is the little charity project, Oliver announced loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Westminster's elite, slumming it with the janitor. Julian stood slowly. Her name is Amina, and she's a better teacher than anyone you've ever had. She's the help, Oliver sneered. And you're embarrassing yourself. Embarrassing all of us. How? May challenged. By learning? By actually giving a damn about education instead of just buying our way through. Oliver's face reddened. Your scholarship trash. You don't get an opinion. The cafeteria fell silent. Julian stepped forward, voice steady. Apologize. Now. Or what? Oliver laughed. You'll have your daddy sue me? Oh wait, I heard he cut you off. You're not even rich anymore. You're just another nobody pretending to matter. The words were designed to wound. A month ago, they would have. But Julian had spent weeks learning what mattered. And it wasn't money or status or approval from people like Oliver. You're right, Julian said calmly. I'm not my family's name anymore. I'm just Julian. And I'd rather be nobody with something real to say than somebody hollow pretending to be full. He turned to walk away, but Oliver grabbed his shoulder. We're not done. Yes, came a firm voice from behind them. You are. Dr. Foster stood there, flanked by two other teachers, her expression glacial. Mr. Grant Hughes, my office. The rest of you, back to lunch. As Oliver skulked away, Dr. Foster caught Julian's eye and gave the smallest nod of approval. May touched Julian's arm. That was brave. That was necessary, Julian replied. But inside, his heart was racing. Not with fear. With purpose. The revolution was no longer quiet. And there was no going back. Spring arrived tentatively in London, as if uncertain of its welcome. Daffodils pushed through the soil in Hyde Park, and daylight stretched a little longer each evening. But inside Westminster Academy, the atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to tension. The study group had grown. What started with 6 students now included 12, then 15. They met before school, during lunch, after final bell. The storage room was too small, so they moved to an unused classroom in the arts wing, one with peeling paint and creaky desks that the school had forgotten about. Amina taught them all with the same fierce attention she'd given Julian. She didn't water down complexity or coddle insecurity. She pushed each student to their edge and then showed them how to climb higher. Learning isn't comfortable, she'd say when someone complained about a difficult text. If you're comfortable, you're not growing. You're just confirming what you already believe. The results were undeniable. Test scores improved. Essays became sharper, more confident. Students who'd been invisible suddenly had things to say, and more importantly, the tools to say them well. But success breeds resentment. The first warning came from an unexpected source, Mr. Whitmore, the head of facilities, the man who'd originally given Amina permission to use the storage room. He found Julian and Amina after a particularly intense session on Paulo Freire's theories of education. Amina, he said, his usually friendly face creased with concern. A word. They stepped into the hallway. I've received complaints, he said quietly. From administration. They're saying you're conducting unauthorized classes. That parents are concerned about unqualified staff having access to students. Amina's expression didn't change. I'm not teaching curriculum. I'm offering voluntary support. I know that, Mr. Whitmore said, and I support what you're doing. But Mrs. Blackwell, the vice principal, she's building a case. She wants you to stop. Why? Julian demanded. What's the actual problem? Mr. Whitmore sighed. The problem is you're making certain people look bad. Expensive tutors, fancy programs, all the resources money can buy, and a cleaning woman with a pile of books is getting better results. That's threatening. To who? Julian pressed. To a system that profits from convincing people they need to pay for education. You're proving they're wrong. Amina touched Mr. Whitmore's arm. Thank you for the warning. I appreciate your support. After he left, Julian turned to her, frustration boiling over. This is insane. You're helping students learn, actually learn, and they want to shut you down. Of course they do, Amina replied calmly. Systems don't like being exposed. Especially when their exposure comes from the bottom. So what do? We keep teaching. Until we can't. Julian shook his head. That's not good enough. There has to be something more. Amina studied him. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it's time people knew what was happening here. Really knew. Julian spent that evening. In his room, smaller now, since his father had indeed cut him off. He'd moved from the Belgravia townhouse to a modest flat in Earl's Court, funded by a part-time job at a bookstore. The transition had been jarring but clarifying. He opened his laptop and began to write. Not an essay for class, but something different. A manifesto, maybe. Or a testimony. The words poured out. His journey from privilege to purpose, from emptiness to education. He wrote about Amina, about what real teaching looked like, about how the most valuable learning he'd ever experienced came not from expensive institutions but from a woman the system had discarded. He wrote about his classmates, May's brilliance, Jamal's insight, Priya's courage, Sophie's creativity. He wrote about how they'd all been failed by a system that measured worth in tuition fees and family names rather than curiosity and commitment. When he finished, it was 3 a.m. The piece was raw, angry, hopeful, over 3,000 words of unfiltered truth. He titled it, "The Education I Never Paid For, What a Cleaning Woman Taught Me About Learning." Then he sent it to the school newspaper, and to the Guardian's education section, and to his father. The response was immediate and explosive. The school newspaper published it within 48 hours. By Friday morning, every student at Westminster Academy had read Julian's piece. Some in secret, others openly, passing printed copies between classes like contraband. The Guardian called on Friday afternoon. They wanted to run it in their Sunday education supplement with an extended interview. Julian's phone buzzed constantly. Text messages from classmates he'd never spoken to. Emails from students at other schools. Messages of support, anger, confusion, gratitude. But the most significant response came from his father. Richard Pemberton Cross appeared at Julian's flat Saturday evening, unannounced. Julian opened the door to find him standing there in casual clothes, jeans, a sweater, looking more human than Julian had seen him in years. "Can I come in?" Richard asked. Julian stepped aside wordlessly. They sat at the small kitchen table, the silence heavy between them. Finally, Richard spoke. "I read what you wrote. And it terrified me." Julian blinked, surprised. "Why?" Richard leaned forward, hands clasped. "Because you wrote about feeling invisible in your own life. About being hollow. And I realized, I did that. I made you feel that way." "Dad." "Let me finish," Richard interrupted. "I spent your entire childhood teaching you that success meant money and power and influence. That what mattered was what you had, not who you were. And when you struggled academically, I thought the solution was more resources, better tutors, higher expectations, more pressure." He paused, voice cracking slightly. "It never occurred to me that what you actually needed was to be seen. Not as my son. Not as a Pemberton Cross. Just as Julian." Julian felt his eyes burn. "Why didn't you see me?" "Because I was never seen either," Richard admitted. "My father was the same way. Cold. Demanding. Love through achievement. I thought I was being strong. I was just being absent." "So what now?" Julian asked quietly. Richard pulled an envelope from his pocket. "I'm not going to pretend I understand everything you're doing. This woman Amina, I don't know her. I don't know her methods. But I know this, you're different. You're awake in a way you weren't before. You care about something. You're building something." He slid the envelope across the table. "This isn't a bribe. It's not control. It's just support. Do with it what you need." Julian opened it. A check. Enough to cover rent for 6 months and then some. "I don't want your money to change you," Richard continued. "I want it to free you. To let you keep doing whatever this is without worrying about survival." Julian looked at his father, really looked at him, and saw something he'd never noticed before. Regret. Vulnerability. "Oh, thank you," Julian said. Richard nodded. "Your mother wants to meet her. Amina. Would that be possible?" "I'll ask," Julian replied. "But I can't promise anything. She doesn't perform for people." "Good," Richard said. "Neither should you." Monday morning brought a different kind of storm. Mrs. Blackwell, the vice principal, summoned Julian to her office at 8:15. Her expression was carved from ice. "Mr. Pemberton Cross. Sit." Julian remained standing. "I'd rather not." Her eyebrow arched. "This isn't a negotiation." "Neither is education," Julian replied. "But you seem to be treating it like one." Mrs. Blackwell's jaw tightened. "Your article has created significant disruption. Parents are calling. Donors are questioning. The board is concerned. Concerned about what? That students are actually learning. Concerned about unauthorized instruction from unqualified staff, she shot back. Concerned about liability. Concerned about a narrative that paints this institution as failing. But you are failing, Julian said. Not the building or the resources. The people. You're failing to see students who don't fit your perfect model. You're failing to support teachers who actually care. You're failing to recognize talent when it's standing right in front of you in a cleaning uniform. Mrs. Blackwell stood, her voice dropping to something dangerous. Ms. Cattry's contract will not be renewed. She'll finish this term and then her employment here is terminated. Julian felt his world tilt. You can't. I can. And I will. This institution has standards. Protocols. She violated them. By teaching. By overstepping, Mrs. Blackwell corrected. Now you have a choice. You can continue this crusade and find yourself expelled for insubordination. Or you can focus on your studies, complete your A-levels, and move forward with your life. Julian stared at her, understanding suddenly how systems maintain themselves. Not through strength, but through fear. Through the threat of consequences. Through convincing people that survival meant silence. No, he said simply. Excuse me? I said no. I won't be quiet. I won't stop. And if you expel me, I'll make sure every newspaper in London knows why. Mrs. Blackwell's expression turned glacial. You're gambling with your future. I'm investing in it, Julian replied. There's a difference. He walked out before she could respond. The news spread through the school like wildfire. Amina was being fired. The study group was being shut down. And Julian was on the verge of expulsion. That afternoon, something unprecedented happened. At exactly 2:30, during the final period, 12 students stood up in their various classes and walked out. They converged in the main hallway, holding hastily made signs. Let her teach. Education over institution. We stand with Amina. Within minutes, 12 became 30. Then 50. Then over 100 students poured into the corridor, their voices rising in chant. Teachers emerged from classrooms, some angry, some confused, some quietly supportive. Julian found himself at the front, not because he'd planned it, but because the crowd had pushed him there. Beside him stood May, Jamal, Priya, Sophie, and a dozen others whose lives had been changed by a woman who'd never asked for recognition. Mrs. Blackwell appeared at the top of the main staircase, flanked by security. Return to your classes immediately, she commanded, or face suspension. Suspend all of us then, May shouted back. We're not moving. The standoff stretched. Phones appeared, recording everything. This was no longer just a school issue. This was becoming a story. And then through the crowd, Amina appeared. She walked calmly, steadily, until she stood in the center of the hallway. The students parted for her, instinctively respectful. Stop, she said, her voice carrying without shouting. All of you, stop. The chanting faded. Amina looked around at the gathered students, her expression both proud and pained. What you're doing here is beautiful. And brave. But it's not necessary. Yes, it is, Julian protested. They're firing you because you're too good at what you do. Because you're proving they don't matter. They're firing me because systems protect themselves, Amina replied. That's what systems do. And fighting them this way, right now, will only hurt you. Suspensions. Expulsions. Marks on your records. We don't care, Priya said, and dozens of voices echoed the sentiment. Amina smiled sadly. I know you don't. That's what makes you extraordinary. But I care. Because my job, my real job, the one I was born to do, is to protect your futures, not sacrifice them. She turned to face Mrs. Blackwell. I'll leave quietly. On one condition. The vice principal descended the stairs. What condition? These students did nothing wrong. No disciplinary action. Not a single mark on any record. They were simply expressing their voice. That's what education is supposed to teach. Mrs. Blackwell considered this. The cameras were still recording. The crowd was still watching. She was trapped by her own rules about optics and consequences. Fine, she said tersely. Return to class. All of you. Now. The students hesitated, looking to Amina. Go, she said gently. Grow. Become who you're meant to be. That's how you honor what we built together. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd dispersed. But as they left, each student touched Amina's hand or shoulder, a wordless thank you, a promise to remember. Julian was the last to leave. This isn't over. No, Amina agreed. It's not. But the next chapter isn't about fighting them. It's about building something they can't tear down. How? She handed him a folded piece of paper. I've been thinking about this for a while. I just needed to know someone was ready to help. Julian unfolded it. A proposal. Ambitious. Impossible. And absolutely necessary. The Katri Learning Collective, he read aloud. An independent education center for students who learn differently. Not a school, Amina clarified. The space. Where learning isn't about grades or money or fitting into systems. Where it's about becoming fully human. Julian looked up, tears in his eyes. When do we start? The moment I leave here, Amina said. But I can't do it alone. You won't have to, Julian promised. I'll find funding. Support. Whatever it takes. Amina squeezed his shoulder. Then we've got work to do. As she walked away for the last time as an employee of Westminster Academy, Julian watched her go with a strange feeling in his chest. Not loss. Not sadness. Purpose. Finally, completely, undeniably, purpose. The system had tried to silence her. Instead, they'd just given her a reason to build something better. The abandoned community center in Southwark smelled of mildew and forgotten promises. Graffiti covered the walls. Windows were boarded up. The floor was littered with debris. Julian stood in the middle of the main room, hands on his hips, trying to see past the decay to what it could become. It's perfect, he said. Beside him, Amina raised an eyebrow. Perfect for what? Tetanus. Perfect for starting over. He turned to her, eyes bright with possibility. No one expects anything from this place. No history. No reputation. Just space we can fill with something real. Amina walked slowly through the room, her footsteps echoing. Do you know how much work this will take? Renovation. Permits. Insurance. Curriculum development. Staffing. Yes, Julian said. And I know we can do it. With what money? He pulled out his phone, showing her a spreadsheet. My father's check covers the lease for a year. I've been reaching out to everyone I know. Classmates, parents, former teachers. Dr. Foster connected me with a grant for alternative education programs. We're not wealthy, but we're not starting from nothing. Amina studied the numbers, then looked at him. You've been planning this. Since the day you handed me that proposal, Julian admitted. I couldn't save your job at Westminster. But maybe I can help build something better. For a long moment, Amina said nothing. Then she smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. Then let's get to work. The transformation took 3 months of relentless effort. Julian learned skills he'd never imagined needing. How to negotiate with contractors. How to read building codes. How to write grant applications that told stories instead of just asking for money. He worked the bookstore in the mornings, renovated the center in the afternoons, and handled paperwork late into the night. His hands developed calluses. His back ached. He'd never felt more alive. Amina recruited a team of fellow educators, people who'd been pushed aside by traditional institutions for various reasons. Mr. Chen, a mathematics teacher who'd been fired for spending too much time with struggling students. Dr. Okonkwo, a biologist who'd challenged standardized testing protocols. Ms. Rivera, an artist whose methods were deemed too unconventional. Together, they built a curriculum that was radical in its simplicity. What does each student need to learn? How do they learn best? What gets in the way? No grades. No rankings. Just growth, measured individually, celebrated collectively. The Guardian article had created unexpected ripples. Other students reached out, Kids who'd been expelled, who'd dropped out, who'd never fit into traditional classrooms. Kids with dyslexia, ADHD, anxiety, depression. Kids from foster care, from poverty, from families that didn't understand them. The waiting list grew before they'd even opened the doors. "We can't accommodate everyone," Amina said one evening, reviewing applications. "Not yet." "So we start small," Julian replied. 20 students. Prove the concept works. Then expand. They selected their first cohort carefully. Not based on test scores or family income, but on something harder to quantify: readiness to engage, willingness to be uncomfortable, hunger for something more than what they'd been offered. May was accepted, of course. So were Jamal, Priya, and Sophie. But they also brought in students Julian had never met. Marcus, 16, who'd been expelled from 4 schools for behavioral issues but wrote poetry that made people cry. Zara, 15, who'd stopped speaking in class after years of being told she talked too much. David, 17, who'd survived homelessness and was determined to understand economics so he could change systems that had failed him. Each had a story. Each had been failed by education as usual. Each deserved better. The Khatri Learning Collective opened its doors on a gray Monday in September. No ribbon-cutting ceremony. No press release. Just 20 students, 5 teachers, and a space that smelled of fresh paint and possibility. Amina stood before them that first morning, her expression serious but warm. "This is not a second chance," she began. "This is not a backup plan. This is not where you come because you failed somewhere else. This is where you come because you're ready to do something different. Something harder. Something real." She paused, looking at each face. Traditional schools teach you to compete, to compare yourselves to others, to measure your worth in grades and rankings. We won't do that here. Instead, we'll teach you to collaborate, to see yourself clearly, to measure your growth against who you were yesterday, not who someone else is today. Julian watched from the back of the room, his heart full. "You'll read difficult books," Amina continued. "You'll write until your hand cramps. You'll argue with ideas and with each other. You'll be frustrated, confused, uncomfortable. And that's when you'll know you're learning." A hand went up. Marcus, the poet with the disciplinary record. "What if we fail?" he asked. Amina smiled. "You will fail. Many times. Failure isn't the opposite of success here. It's part of the process. What matters is what you do after. Do you give up? Or do you try differently?" "And what if we disagree with you?" Zara asked, speaking for the first time in months. "What if we think you're wrong?" "Then you better have a good argument," Amina replied. "Because that's what education is. Not memorizing my opinions, but developing your own and learning to defend them with evidence and clarity." The students exchanged glances, something shifting in the room. Not fear. Not doubt. The first weeks were chaotic. Beautiful chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Students who'd been trained to sit silently and absorb information struggled with the expectation to engage, to question, to lead their own learning. Some rebelled, testing boundaries. Others shut down, afraid of doing it wrong. But gradually, something emerged. A culture. A rhythm. Mornings began with reading circles. Not everyone reading the same text, but each student choosing something challenging and sharing what they discovered. Marcus introduced the group to Audre Lorde. Zara brought in Virginia Woolf. David shared excerpts from Marx's Capital and facilitated a debate about economic systems that lasted 3 days. Afternoons were for projects, deep dives into questions students actually cared about. Sophie explored neurodiversity through art and science, creating visual representations of how different brains processed information. May researched the history of immigration policy, connecting her own family's story to broader patterns of exclusion and belonging. Julian taught a seminar on privilege and power, drawing from his own experience. He didn't lecture. He shared. His failures, his realizations, his ongoing struggle to understand what it meant to use advantages for something beyond personal gain. "I was handed everything," he told the class one afternoon. "Money, access, opportunity. And I nearly wasted it all because no one taught me that having something isn't the same as being someone." That comfort can be a cage. That sometimes you have to lose everything to figure out what actually matters. Do you regret it? Priest, losing your family's money? Your position? Julian considered this carefully. I regret the time I wasted. The people I hurt with my arrogance. But losing the things I thought defined me? That was the best thing that ever happened. Because it forced me to ask, who is Julian without the Pemberton Cross name? And for the first time in my life, I'm finding out. But success attracted attention. And not all of it was positive. Westminster Academy watched the collective's growth with barely concealed hostility. Private schools across London began asking uncomfortable questions. If these rejected students could thrive in an alternative setting, what did that say about traditional institutions? Articles appeared in education journals. First skeptical, then curious, then increasingly supportive. The BBC reached out for a documentary feature. And with visibility came vulnerability. One November evening, Julian received an email from the Southwark Council's Education Department. They wanted to conduct an inspection. Assess whether the collective met educational standards. Ensure student welfare and safety. Julian forwarded it to Amina immediately, then called her. This is political, he said. Someone's putting pressure on the council. Probably, Amina agreed, her voice calm as ever. So we prepare. We document everything. Student progress. Attendance. Engagement. We show them exactly what we're doing and why it works. And if they shut us down anyway? Then we fight. But Julian? We fight with evidence, not emotion. We show them data they can't dispute. Stories they can't ignore. Results that prove traditional methods aren't the only way. Over the next 3 weeks, the collective transformed into a showcase. Students compiled portfolios documenting their learning. Teachers prepared detailed progress reports. Parents, many of whom had been skeptical at first, wrote testimonials about changes they'd witnessed. Marcus, once labeled unteachable, had written a 50-page manuscript about urban poetry and identity. Zara, who'd been silent for a year, was now facilitating community workshops on finding your voice. David had started a non-profit helping homeless youth navigate social services. The inspection lasted 2 days. 3 council officials observed classes, interviewed students and teachers, reviewed documentation. Julian barely slept, running through every possible objection, every potential criticism. On the final day, the lead inspector, a woman named Dr. Kowalski, requested a meeting with Amina and Julian. They sat in the small office they'd created, hearts pounding. Dr. Kowalski opened her folder, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up and smiled. I've been in education for 30 years, she began. I've inspected hundreds of institutions. And I've never seen anything quite like this. Julian's stomach dropped. Is that? That's a compliment, Dr. Kowalski interrupted. What you're doing here, it's unconventional, certainly. It challenges every assumption about how learning should look. But the results? She tapped the folder. Undeniable. Your students are engaged. They're growing. They're developing critical thinking skills that most A-level students never acquire. Amina leaned forward. So you're approved. Not just approved. I'm recommending you as a model for alternative education programs across the borough. She paused. Though I suspect you'll face opposition from more traditional institutions. We already do, Julian said. Then keep doing what you're doing, Dr. Kowalski replied. Because education needs more of this. More spaces where students can be fully human, not just test takers. After she left, Julian and Amina sat in stunned silence. Then Amina laughed, a sound of relief and triumph and sheer exhaustion. We did it, Julian said. No, Amina corrected, standing and placing a hand on his shoulder. You did it. You took an idea and made it real. You fought when it would have been easier to walk away. You believed when everyone said it was impossible. I learned from the best, Julian replied. Then the lesson took, Amina said softly. Now comes the harder part. What's that? Sustaining it, growing it, making sure it outlasts us both. Julian nodded, understanding. This wasn't an ending. It was barely a beginning. But for the first time since he'd sat failing in Westminster Academy's back row, he knew exactly what he was building toward. Not just a school. A revolution. One student at a time. "3 years passed like pages turning in a book you can't put down. Each season brought changes to the Katri Learning Collective, growth measured not in metrics but in transformations witnessed and celebrated. The waiting list grew to over 200 students. The collective expanded into the building next door, then launched satellite programs in 3 other London boroughs. What had started as one woman with a mop and one boy with everything and nothing had become a movement. But Julian learned something crucial in those 3 years. Success is harder to manage than failure. Failure is simple. You know what you've lost. Success demands constant vigilance, constant questioning, constant resistance to becoming the very thing you sought to replace. It was a Tuesday in May when the Real test arrived. Julian sat in a conference room in Canary Wharf, surrounded by men in expensive suits. The Meridian Education Group, a massive private equity firm, had been circling the collective for months, studying their model, analyzing their results. Now they wanted to buy them. "Let me be clear," said Martin Ashford, Meridian CEO, sliding a folder across the polished table. "We're not talking about acquisition in the traditional sense. We're talking about partnership, investment, expansion." Julian opened the folder. The numbers made his breath catch. £50 million. Full operational control remaining with Amina. Expansion to 20 cities within 5 years. "Why us?" Julian asked, though he suspected he knew. "Because you've cracked something every education company in the world is chasing," Martin replied. "Authentic engagement. Real learning. Students who actually give a damn. And you've done it without gaming the system or lowering standards. That's worth replicating." "At what cost?" Julian pressed. "What do you get out of this?" Martin leaned back, fingers steepled. "ROI, eventually. These students you're helping, they'll become high earners, leaders, innovators. Success stories. We want to be the company that made that possible. The brand association alone is worth billions." Julian felt something twist in his gut. "You want to turn education into a profit center. We want to turn a successful model into something sustainable and scalable," Martin corrected. "You can help 200 students, or you can help 200,000. Isn't that what you want? Maximum impact." "I need to discuss this with Amina," Julian said, closing the folder. "Of course, take your time." Martin smiled, the practiced smile of someone accustomed to getting what they wanted. But Julian? Opportunities like this don't wait forever. That evening, Julian found Amina in the collective's library, surrounded by her current cohort of students. They were deep in discussion about bell hooks teaching to transgress, their voices animated, challenging each other's interpretations. He waited until the session ended, until the students had filtered out with calls of "Good night, Miss Amina," and "See you tomorrow, Julian." When they were alone, he told her about the meeting. Amina listened without interruption, her face impassive. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "What do you think?" she finally asked. "I think £50 million could change a lot of lives," Julian said carefully. "But I also think there's a reason they want us. And it's not because they care about education the way we do." "So you don't trust them?" "I don't trust their motivations. They see $signs where we see students. They want to replicate a model. We want to transform lives. Those aren't the same thing." Amina nodded slowly. "Do you remember what I told you the first day we started teaching together? You said a lot of things. I said, the moment you stop asking why, and start asking, how much, that's when you've lost the plot." She stood, walking to the window that overlooked the street. "Money isn't evil, Julian. But it changes things. It shifts priorities. What starts as expansion becomes bureaucracy. What begins as inspiration becomes replication. And suddenly, you're running an education business instead of transforming lives." "So we say no?" "We say no to this," Amina clarified. "But that doesn't mean we say no to growth. It means we grow deliberately, organically. We train teachers in our methods and send them out to start their own collectives. We open source our curriculum. We share everything freely so anyone can replicate what we've built without needing our permission or their money. Julian smiled. You want to give it away. I want to make it impossible to own, Amina corrected. Knowledge isn't property. Education isn't a product. The moment we treat them like commodities, we've betrayed everything we built this place to be. Martin won't like that answer. Martin will survive, Amina said. The question is, will we? Will we survive becoming successful without becoming successful at the cost of our principles? Julian thought of his father, of Westminster Academy, of every institution that had started with noble intentions and ended in protecting its own power. We'll survive, he said, because we won't forget why we started. The response to Meridian was brief and definitive. Thank you, but the Catry Learning Collective is not for sale. However, our model is freely available to anyone committed to student-centered education. Martin Ashford called personally incredulous. You're turning down £50 million? We're turning down £50 million of someone else's control, Julian replied. There's a difference. The call ended badly. Within weeks, Meridian had launched their own alternative education initiative, a glossy, well-funded network that borrowed the collective's language but hollowed out its substance. Some worried this would undermine what they'd built, but Amina remained unconcerned. Let them copy the surface, she said. They can't copy the soul. And students will know the difference. She was right. The Meridian schools opened with fanfare and closed within 18 months. Unable to sustain the authentic community that made the collective's model work. Meanwhile, the real revolution continued quietly. Teachers trained at the collective open centers in Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow. A program started in Dublin. Another in Cardiff. Each remained independent, connected by philosophy rather than ownership. They shared resources, strategies, stories, but none belonged to a corporation or answered to shareholders. They belonged to students, to teachers, to communities, to the belief that education was about liberation, not certification. Julian turned 21 on a Wednesday in October. No party, no celebration, just another day of work at the collective. But that evening, Amina asked him to stay late. I have something for you, she said, handing him a wrapped package. Inside was a leather-bound journal, beautiful, worn, familiar. This is yours, Julian said, recognizing it immediately. The journal she'd carried during their early morning sessions, filled with her notes and reflections. It was mine, Amina corrected. Now it's yours. Every teacher needs to document their journey. Not for publication. For clarity. For those moments when you forget why you started and need to remember. Julian opened it carefully, seeing her handwriting, observations about students, questions about methods, quotes from the thinkers who'd shaped her philosophy. And on the first page, a new entry in fresh ink. To Julian, who taught me that transformation isn't about changing who someone is, but revealing who they've always been. Who proved that privilege, when examined honestly, can become fuel for justice rather than comfort. Who reminds me daily that the best teachers are those who never stop being students. Keep questioning. Keep building. Keep seeing people as they are and who they might become. The world needs more of that. Okay. Julian's vision blurred. Thank you doesn't feel like enough. Then don't just say it, Amina replied. Live it. Keep doing this work. Not for recognition or success or redemption, but because it matters. Because young people deserve adults who see them clearly and love them fiercely and believe in them even when they don't believe in themselves. Like you did for me. Like we did for each other, she corrected. You forget, I needed you as much as you needed me. I'd lost my purpose. You reminded me what it felt like to teach someone who was hungry to learn. You gave me back myself. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the London sky. What's next? Julian finally asked. Amina smiled. Whatever we build next. Together. 5 years after the collective opened, Julian received an unexpected invitation. Westminster Academy was hosting a symposium on innovative education. They wanted him to speak. His first instinct was to refuse. But Amina encouraged him otherwise. "Go," she said. "Not to gloat. To teach." Some of those teachers, those administrators, they're trapped in systems they don't know how to change. Show them there's another way. So Julian returned to the marble hallways where he'd once drifted like a ghost. The building looked the same, prestigious, imposing, cold. But he was different. The symposium was held in the Grand Hall, packed with educators from across London. Julian took the stage, looking out at familiar and unfamiliar faces. He didn't use notes. "My name is Julian," he began. "Not Pemberton Cross, though that's the name I was born with. Just Julian. Because I learned something in these halls years ago that changed everything. Your name doesn't define you. Your choices do." He told his story. The failure. The fear. The shame. The woman who'd seen him when he was invisible. "I was taught that education was about achievement," he continued. "About grades and credentials and getting ahead. And when I couldn't achieve those things, I thought I was worthless." He paused. "But I wasn't worthless. I was just learning in a system that wasn't designed for how I learned. That didn't care about what I needed. That measured me against arbitrary standards and found me wanting." Faces in the audience shifted. Some uncomfortable, some intrigued, some deeply moved. Amina Khatri taught me that education isn't about fitting into a system. It's about becoming fully human. It's about learning to think and feel and question and create. It's about seeing yourself and others clearly. And that can't be measured on a standardized test. He shared data from the collective. Engagement rates. Student testimonials. Long-term outcomes. Not to brag, but to prove a point. When you center students' humanity, everything else follows. The question isn't whether alternative models can work, he concluded. It's whether we have the courage to try them. To let go of control and trust that students, when truly seen and supported, will exceed every expectation we place on them. The applause started slowly, then built. A standing ovation. But Julian wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the back row, where Amina stood, arms crossed, a proud smile on her face. After the talk, several Westminster teachers approached him. Dr. Foster was among them, eyes bright. "You've come a long way." "We all have," Julian replied, gesturing to Amina. "Thanks to her." Dr. Foster turned to Amina. "I owe you an apology. I saw what you were doing back then. I should have defended you." "You did what you could in a system that punished dissent," Amina said gently. "I don't blame you. I blame the system. And the best revenge? We built something better." Dr. Foster nodded, tears in her eyes. "Would you consider training some of our staff? Not to replace what we do, but to complement it? To help us see students the way you see them?" Amina looked at Julian, a silent conversation passing between them. "On one condition," Amina said. "We don't train teachers to use our methods. We train them to develop their own. We don't give them scripts. We give them principles. See the student. Honor their humanity. Let learning be messy. Value questions over answers. That's not a curriculum. That's a mindset." "When can we start?" Dr. Foster asked. 10 years after Julian first met Amina in that quiet corridor, the landscape of education in London had shifted. The Khatri Learning Collective now operated in 15 locations across the UK. But more significant than the expansion was the ripple effect. Dozens of schools had adopted elements of their approach. Student-centered learning. Project-based curricula. Emphasis on critical thinking over memorization. It wasn't perfect. Systems changed slowly, reluctantly. But change was happening. Julian, now 27, had completed a master's degree in education policy. Not to validate what he knew, but to learn how to advocate for systemic change more effectively. He split his time between the collective, policy work, and training educators across the country. Amina, approaching 65, showed no signs of slowing down. She still taught daily, still met with struggling students, still asked the hard questions that made people uncomfortable. On a Thursday afternoon in March, they sat together in the collective's expanded library, now boasting over 10,000 volumes, most donated by people who believed in their mission. I've been thinking, Amina said, setting down her tea. About legacy. Julian looked up from his laptop. You're not retiring. Not yet. But eventually. She smiled. And when I do, this place needs to continue without me. Without you even. It needs to be bigger than any individual. It already is, Julian said. Look around. The teachers here, they've internalized the philosophy. The students mentor new students. We've documented everything. It'll survive. Surviving isn't the same as thriving, Amina countered. I want to create something that ensures this model continues to evolve. That prevents it from calcifying into dogma. She pulled out a proposal. Julian recognized her handwriting, those careful notes that had changed his life. The Khatri Institute for Educational Transformation, he read aloud. A research and training center dedicated to student-centered pedagogy. Not just training, Amina clarified, but ongoing research, innovation, a place where educators come not to be told what to do, but to experiment, to fail, to discover, where we study what works and why and share it freely. Julian's mind raced. This would require significant funding, infrastructure, staff. I know, which is why I'm asking, will you help me build it? He looked at her. This woman who'd saved him when he was drowning, who'd seen him when he was invisible, who'd taught him that transformation wasn't about becoming someone new but discovering who he'd always been. Always, he said. Whatever it takes. Building the institute took 3 years of relentless work. Fundraising that prioritized small donors over large grants, ensuring no single entity could claim ownership. Recruiting researchers committed to educational justice over career advancement. Designing a physical space that embodied their values, collaborative, accessible, welcoming. Richard Pemberton Cross became an unexpected ally. He'd spent years observing his son's transformation, slowly unlearning the cold pragmatism that had defined his own life. I want to contribute, he told Julian over dinner one evening. Not to control anything. Not to put my name on a building. Just to help. Why? Julian asked, genuinely curious. Richard set down his fork. Because I spent decades measuring success in money and power. And I watched those things nearly destroy my son. What you and Amina have built, it's the kind of success that actually matters. It changes lives. Creates value that can't be quantified on a balance sheet. Dad. Let me finish, Richard interrupted gently. I can't undo the damage I did. The pressure. The emotional distance. But I can use what I have, the connections, the resources, to support something meaningful. To help you build a future where other kids don't have to choose between family approval and personal growth. The donation was substantial but came with no strings attached. Just a father trying to support his son. Trying to be better. The Khatri Institute for Educational Transformation opened on a brilliant September morning. The building, a converted Victorian school in Hackney, was filled with light and books and possibility. Research labs sat alongside classrooms where educators could practice new methods. A library housed texts on pedagogy, psychology, sociology, and philosophy. Studios offered space for artistic and experiential learning. But the heart of the institute was something simpler. A large circular room with comfortable chairs arranged in concentric circles. No desks, no podium, no hierarchy of space. This is where we'll gather, Amina explained to the assembled group, 50 educators from across the UK who'd been selected for the Institute's inaugural fellowship. To question. To learn from each other. She stood in the center of the circle, Julian beside her. Some of you come from elite schools. Others from under-resourced communities. Some have decades of experience. Others are just beginning. But you're here because you share something crucial. You believe education can be different. Better. More humane. Amina paused, looking around the circle at faces reflecting every shade of hope and skepticism and determination. Over the next year, we'll challenge everything you think you know about teaching and learning. We'll examine your assumptions. Question your methods. Push you to grow in ways that will be uncomfortable. A few nervous laughs rippled through the group. But we'll also support you, Julian added. Because transformation isn't about tearing people down. It's about building them up. About seeing the teacher you are and the teacher you're becoming. One participant raised her hand, a young woman named Asha from Birmingham. What if we fail? What if we try new methods and they don't work? Amina smiled. Then you'll have learned something valuable. Failure isn't the opposite of success in education. It's part of the process. The only real failure is refusing to try, refusing to grow, refusing to admit when something isn't working. The fellowship program became legendary. Teachers arrived burned out, cynical, questioning whether education could truly change. They left energized, clear-eyed, equipped with both practical strategies and philosophical foundations. More importantly, they left connected, part of a network of educators committed to transformation. They met regularly, shared resources, supported each other through challenges. Within 5 years, Institute Fellows had influenced policy in 8 different school districts. They'd published research that challenged conventional wisdom about assessment and achievement. They trained over 2,000 teachers in student-centered methods. But the statistic Amina valued most was simpler: student satisfaction and engagement scores in schools where Institute Fellows taught were consistently higher than the national average. Not because they'd found a magic formula, but because they'd learned to see students as fully human. On Amina's 68th birthday, the collective and Institute hosted a celebration. Not for her, she'd explicitly forbidden that, but for education itself. For 10 years of transformation. For thousands of lives changed. The event was simple: current and former students sharing what they'd learned, where they'd gone, who they'd become. Marcus, the unteachable poet, was now a published author and youth advocate, working with at-risk teens across London. Zara, who'd been silent for a year, had founded a nonprofit supporting young women finding their voices through storytelling and activism. David, who'd experienced homelessness, had completed a PhD in economics and was advising the mayor's office on poverty policy. May was a human rights lawyer. Jamal, a journalist. Priya, a teacher at the Institute. Sophie, a neuroscientist studying learning differences. Each had a story. Each credited not just Amina's teaching, but the community that had seen them, challenged them, believed in them. Julian watched from the side of the room, his chest tight with emotion. Proud? Amina asked, appearing beside him. Beyond words, he replied. Look at what we built. Look at what they built, Amina corrected. We just created the space. They did the work of becoming. Julian turned to her. Do you ever regret it? Leaving the university? The prestigious career? Ending up cleaning floors? Amina was quiet for a moment. I regret that I had to lose everything to remember what mattered. I regret the years I spent caring more about professional recognition than about actual learning. But cleaning floors? She smiled. That was where I met you. Where I remembered my purpose. So no. I don't regret that at all. I never thanked you properly, Julian said. For seeing me when I was invisible. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. You thank me every day, Amina replied. By doing this work. By seeing others the way I saw you. By building spaces where students can become fully themselves. She gestured to the room full of young people laughing, sharing, dreaming. This is my thanks. Their transformation. Their joy. Their futures. This is what education is supposed to be. Julian stood to speak, the room gradually quieting. I was 17 when I first met Amina, he began. I had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. I was failing every class. Drowning in a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty within. He paused, finding her in the crowd. She could have ignored me. Should have, probably. I was arrogant, entitled, a walking embodiment of everything wrong with a system that prioritizes wealth over worth. But she saw something I couldn't see in myself. Not potential. Everyone talks about potential like it's some abstract thing waiting to be unlocked. She saw my humanity, my fear, my hunger to matter in some way that wasn't just about my family's name. The room was completely silent. She taught me that learning isn't about grades or credentials. It's about transformation. About becoming brave enough to see yourself clearly and humble enough to let yourself be changed by what you discover. Julian looked around at the assembled students and teachers. 10 years ago, I thought success meant accumulating things. Power, money, status. Today, I measure success differently, by the students who discover their voices. By the teachers who remember why they started. By the moments when someone who felt invisible realizes they've been seen all along. He raised his glass. To Amina Khatri, who taught me that the opposite of poverty isn't wealth, it's purpose. That the opposite of ignorance isn't information, it's awareness. That the opposite of failure isn't success, it's transformation. The room erupted in applause, everyone on their feet. Amina wiped tears from her eyes, shaking her head at the fuss. But she was smiling, that rare, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. Julian made his way through the crowd to her side. "Thank you," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "For everything." Amina squeezed his hand. "The work isn't finished." "I know," Julian replied. "It never is. That's what makes it worth doing." She nodded, looking around the room at the community they'd built together. "Then let's keep going." And they did. 15 years after that first conversation in a forgotten corridor, the Khatri Institute had trained over 10,000 educators. The collective model had been adapted in 6 countries. Policy changes influenced by their research had affected millions of students. But the real measure of success wasn't in those numbers. It was in individual moments. A student's eyes lighting up with understanding. A teacher rediscovering their passion. A parent watching their child thrive after years of struggle. It was in the letter Julian received from a student he'd taught 5 years earlier. "I don't know if you remember me. I was the quiet kid in the corner who never spoke up. You asked me once what I was afraid of, and I couldn't answer. Now I can. I was afraid of being seen, of being known, of discovering I was as empty as I felt. But you and Miss Amina taught me that emptiness isn't a character flaw. It's just space waiting to be filled with purpose. I'm in my 2nd year at university now, studying to become a teacher. Because I want to create spaces where kids like me can learn to take up space without shame. Thank you for seeing me." Julian kept that letter on his desk, a reminder of why the work mattered. Amina continued teaching until she was 72. Even then, she didn't fully retire, just shifted to mentoring new teachers, writing, thinking deeply about how education could continue to evolve. She published a book in her 70s, Pedagogy of the Visible, Education as the Practice of Seeing and Being Seen. It became required reading in teacher training programs worldwide. Julian became director of the institute, carrying forward Amina's vision while adding his own insights. He never forgot what it felt like to be lost, to feel worthless, to need someone who believed in him before he could believe in himself. That memory made him a better educator. On the 20th anniversary of the collective, they returned to Westminster Academy for a special event. The school had changed, not completely, but significantly. More student voice in curriculum decisions. More emphasis on growth over grades. More awareness of who was being seen and who remained invisible. Standing in that corridor where everything began, Julian felt the weight of time and transformation. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped me that day?" he asked Amina. She considered this. "I think you would have found your way eventually. Maybe through someone else. Maybe through rock bottom. The trajectory might have been different, but the destination? I think you were always going to become who you are now." "I'm not so sure," Julian replied. Without me, you would have found another teacher," Amina interrupted. "Because that's what people who are truly ready to learn do. They find their teachers. Or their teachers find them. Either way, the learning happens." She paused. "What I gave you wasn't knowledge, Julian. It was permission. Permission to be confused. To fail. To grow. To become someone different from who you were told to be. And once you gave yourself that permission, everything else followed." Julian smiled. "So you're saying you just gave me permission?" "I'm saying transformation was always yours to choose. I just reminded you that you had a choice." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching students rush past on their way to classes. So much had changed. So much remained the same. Ready to keep going? Amina finally asked. Always, Julian replied. And together, they walked forward into whatever came next, not as savior and saved, not as teacher and student, but as two people committed to a simple, radical idea. That every person deserves to be seen, to be challenged, to be believed in, to transform. And that education, at its core, is nothing more and nothing less than the practice of making that possible. One conversation at a time. One student at a time. One transformation at a time. The end.